record. Yeah, we're recording to the computer, and later on I'll upload the video. Okay. So,
Great.
um, feel I've got some words here, but welcome to our online event featuring Senator John Fredrickson. My name is Peter Gadzinski, and I represent the Southwest Omaha Neighborhood Alliance. The Alliance is a city organized group that's sort of an umbrella over some 50 neighborhood associations and homeowner associations in Southwest Omaha. So pretty much, overlapping with your district, John. So before we begin, though, a word about the format. This session is scheduled to last an hour. We'll see how far it goes. Following remarks by Senator Fredrickson, we'll take questions from you, our online audience. Since I don't have, all of you know about chat, so we're just if you have a question, actually with the small number, just raise your hand using the app or something like that, and we'll take the question. But we are recording, and we will upload later to YouTube. So John, if you'd like to just take it away then.
Absolutely. So good evening. It's good to see all you, and thank you, Peter, and the Southwest Neighborhood Association for putting this on. I'm really happy to be here tonight, and happy to share a little bit about the legislative session that we've been having up to this point this year, and hopefully to talk a little bit about what the weeks ahead might look like, and what we might be able to expect for the remainder of the session. But Peter, as Peter said, John Fredrickson. I'm a state senator. I represent District 20 in the Nebraska legislature, which is approximately kind of central West Omaha. So 72nd Street on the east, around 153rd, 55th Street-ish on the west. Pacific is primarily the northern boundary, and the railroad is kind of primarily the southern boundary, so to speak, is kind of the general geography of the district. So.
Okay, are you good? Did something
I'm
happen?
good.
All right.
Oh, no, yeah.
Okay. I thought we muted you for some reason. Didn't know. I'm just keeping the background noise to a minimum. So please continue.
So so it's been a really interesting legislative session. It's my first time. It's my first year. I was just elected in November 2022, as you may be aware. And it's funny because I'm constantly asked by people, how are you doing, or what is it like? Like, what a crazy year to start. And it's interesting because I don't have any other context, right? This is my first year in there, so this is sort of what I know of the job so far. And for those of you who have been following the legislature, it has been a unique year in the Nebraska legislature in that we are beyond the halfway point of our 90-day session, which is the longer session of our biennium. And we have yet to pass a single bill. We have yet to send a single bill to the governor's desk. And this is unprecedented. We've never gone, the legislature's never gone this long without sending a single bill to the governor's desk. And for those of you who've been following the news, a large reason for this is that there has been a filibuster going on in the legislature for an extended period of time. I believe we are about to be entering around the 5th week of that. So that is a direct response to LB 574, which I know, Peter, I think you had on the list of bills of possible interest that people might want to hear a little bit about or have interest in. And so it's been an interesting year to start. There's no question about that. But it's also been, I think, one of the things that has been, as a freshman senator, one thing I found really interesting about this year is that it's really shown, it's sort of been like a master class on the rules, right? So how, like, all the legislative rules that we have in the state legislature, how those rules are used, how to, so whether it's related to motions, priority motions, filibustering, all those things that seem very much kind of in the weeds, and you read about them in the rule book, but you don't always see these things exercised on the floor. And so this year we've seen all sorts of these things exercised on the floor. So that's been really educational as a first year senator to sort of see these different tools in action. Of course, the downfall of that is that I have yet to sort of observe or experience a bill from its inception all the way to the governor's desk. So, I've obviously seen bills and been able to introduce bills to committees. I've seen them be debated on the floor, but we have in the Nebraska legislature, we have 3 rounds of debate. So the furthest bills have gotten so far is to the second round of debate. And tomorrow actually will be the first day where we are debating a bill on the second round of debate. So every bill thus far up until last week has been just first round of debate. We've advanced a handful of them to second rounds of debate, but if you have to take up a bill on second round. So we were hoping to begin to do that tomorrow. So that's kind of like a really high altitude summary of what we've seen so far this year. And I'm happy to kind of get in the weeds into sort of more specifics and answer any questions that folks might have about what's going on down there and what we're seeing.
Jump in here. I'm going to unmute everybody because we have 2 other pretty reasonable people. I always have to be concerned with an online session as to what might happen. Marsha and Tom here, I'm not concerned about that. But I wanted to ask you about, amidst all the hand-wringing over tax cuts and, of course, the culture war issues, which have consumed the session so far, not much has been said about the need to attract and retain talent here in Nebraska. And one part of that, of course, is the high cost and unavailability of affordable housing for workers here in Nebraska. But the other thing that strikes me is that unless your income is extremely low, you do not receive any help from the state for childcare. And that's mainly federal money, as I understand it. So, we know 2 things. One is that on a global basis, the United States is way at the bottom of the league in terms of what it provides for childcare, this assistance it provides. And secondly, that providing childcare is not only positive for the child developmentally, but increases labor participation rates for the spouse, whomever that might be, whoever the caregiver is, if he or she is, taking care of the child, or a big part of the family's income goes to private childcare, that's a discouragement. So I guess my question is there any prospect here in Nebraska for a state subsidy for childcare? And this would be for families of all income levels up to a certain point. I'm sure there'd be a cutoff, but is there any talk about this? Is there any possibility of this happening? That's my question.
It's a great question, and it's frankly it's an issue we need to tackle as a state. And you mentioned affordable housing as well as childcare, and one thing that we're seeing in Nebraska, and this isn't unique to Nebraska, this is across the country, of course, is we're seeing workforce related issues. So we're seeing workforce retention issues. We're seeing issues with attracting, retaining talent, and it's not in any specified industry. This is across the board. And one thing I've learned, certainly in the legislature, is that we're obviously seeing this in Omaha and the more urban areas, but the rural parts of the state are also experiencing workforce shortages. And childcare is particularly challenging in rural parts of the state as well. So, we have issues with this in the urban areas, of course, but rural parts of the state are having this as well. There are a couple bills that have promised this year. Senator Danielle Conrad introduced a child care tax credit bill, which she actually used her personal priority on. So that is a bill that would provide a tax credit for child care related costs for Nebraskans, which is certainly a financial incentive related to child care related services. And Senator Wendy DeBoer introduced a bill that she also personally prioritized, which is I'm trying to think of the exact name of it. I'm going to pull it up, see if I have it here. It's changing provisions related to child care assistance. So this is another financial incentive for child care related resources. My understanding from Senator DeBoer's bill is that these are this is assistance that is currently in place thanks to ARPA funding, but that we might be seeing a sunset with this. So this is a way to maintain this as a resource. But Senator Conrad's bill, the tax credit for childcare, is certainly promising. I think that there's a lot more to be done. This is something that, one thing that's I'm encouraged by with childcare in affordable housing for that matter as well is that there seems to be a general acknowledgement across the legislature that these are issues that we do need to prioritize. So, this is not something where people are arguing about whether it's a real thing or not. There seems to kind of be a general consensus that this is a concern and that this is a statewide issue. Now, of course, there's one thing to agree on something versus to actually take action on it. I am certainly a proponent of doing more as a state for these things because, Peter, to your point earlier, I think that this has a direct impact on our economy. I think this is something that if we are serious about the economic stability of the state and the future of the state, especially from a workforce perspective, we need to ensure that Nebraska is a place where young families can work and be successful in their work. And, obviously key factors of that include being able to be housed as well as affordable childcare and options related to childcare for that.
Thank you. I see Marcia Anderson has a question. Marcia?
John, let's assume that the transgender bill will be filibustered to the end. Let's assume, surprisingly enough, that it got the votes that it got in the last round. So if it filibusters to the end, how much time will we have left to pass anything? Because we have to have a budget, right? And I would assume that they're going to have to pass the rules to implement the voter ID bill. I mean, if we don't get those two things done, we have to get those two things done, right? I mean, does Arch talk about, to the group, like, hey, we better do this because we're going to run out of time? Or
so you're right. There are two things that we are constitutionally required to pass this year. One is the state budget. So that is something that absolutely must happen, and that will happen this year. We will pass the state's budget. The other is a direct result of the ballot initiative for voter ID. So the voters of Nebraska voted to require identification, voter ID for voting in our state. And so it is up to the legislature to sort of determine what that process looks like. So there's a handful of bills that have been heard in the legislature to actually implement that process. And we are required to, that's another policy or bill that we will need to pass this session. There is, it's difficult to say what that's going to look like at this point. And so, and let me elaborate on that a little bit because I think context is really important. So, the context of what's essentially happened this legislative session is that something that's never happened before in Nebraska happened, which was we've seen a handful of bills that were introduced that were highly controversial and very in some ways like very fringe legislation, but legislation that's not unique in the U.S. These are things that we're seeing across the country, particularly as it relates to the transgender community. So there's been a number of different bills related to the trans community that have been introduced throughout the country. And the thing that's kind of unique in our state is that Nebraska historically has been somewhat sheltered from really extreme legislation. And part of the reason for that is just the way that our unicameral works. We are unlike any other legislative body in the country. And so this was the first time that our state legislature has really kind of seen such divisive and extreme legislation introduced. And so in response to that extreme amount of legislation, one of my colleagues, Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, vowed to filibuster the entire session. So she said, basically, if this is the type of legislation that we're going to be introducing in here, then nothing happens. Like, this is just, until this bill is pulled or until this bill dies, nothing happens. So this was going on for about 3 weeks. And then Senator Cavanaugh and Speaker Arch sort of struck a deal where that the bill would be heard on the floor this past week, which it was. We had our first round of debate, which is 8 hours of debate on that bill. And then at the end of the 8 hours of debate, the bill requires 33 votes to get what's called cloture. So if the bill gets 33 votes, then it gets cloture, and then we actually vote on the bill itself, which only needs 25 votes to advance from the first to second round of debate. So when a bill is being filibustered, if it falls short of those 33 votes, the bill dies. So it doesn't get cloture, which means that we don't vote on it and it's gone, it's dead. And so the idea was that once this bill is debated, it would not get cloture, the bill would die, and the session would move on as per usual. It would pick right back up. Senator Kavanaugh had vowed to end the filibuster at that point, and then just proceed as though we would any other session. And the interesting thing was that, I can't speak for Speaker Arch, I can't speak for Senator Kavanaugh, but I think that both parties at the time believed that the bill would not get cloture. I certainly was surprised that the bill got cloture. Well, as the week went on, I became less surprised, but going into the week, I was pretty confident the bill was not going to get cloture. And part of the reason for that is that a number of members of the body hate that bill. And I spoke about this on the floor, like that's the dirty little secret in the legislature, is that very few members of the legislature actually like this bill and think that this is a good idea for Nebraska. And the week was very fascinating because on the first day of debate of the bill, one of my colleagues actually called the question, which is something that you can do. It's sort of a procedural tool you can use, that if you believe that a bill has had substantive debate, you can call a question to end debate on a bill. So about like an hour and a half into the first day of debate, I think only 4 or 5 people maybe spoke at that time. One of my colleagues called the question, which the lieutenant governor, who's the president of the legislature, he actually ruled that is out of order because he was like, there hasn't been full and fair debate on this, obviously. And the legislature actually voted to overrule the chair on that. So that was the first moment of the week where I personally was like, something is going on here, because to overrule the chair it's a really big deal to do that. And I found it fascinating that a number of my colleagues would vote to overrule the chair on this specific bill and this specific issue. We're not talking about, to what we were saying earlier, we're not talking about the state's budget. We're not talking about property taxes. We're not talking about education funding, right? We're not talking about these big complex issues that really are of interest to Nebraskans, workforce retention, affordable housing. I mean, these are the things that are broadband expansion throughout our state. These are the things that are really pressing issues that we do need to tackle as a state, and that's our job in the legislature to do that. We were overruling the chair for the most fringe piece of legislation that's been introduced this year. And so there's been this dynamic that it's almost as though people have really dug their heels in with this in a really intense way. And what's hard for me to wrap my mind around is, why is this the hill we're dying on? Right? Like, I mean, and
John, yeah. That's exactly where I'm like, I don't get this. I don't get why voter ID and the budget are not, I mean, is this, I cannot believe this is the sword they want to die on. Because, I mean, it's clear that Senator Kavanaugh said, if you're going to do this, I'm going to filibuster. So my observation, as you already know, is that you can't point to Michaela Kavanaugh. They're equally as entrenched in their position not to move on this. And so that's where I'm like, when are you going to get to the budget? And when are you going to get to voter ID? And is that all we're going to get to? Because this could go for how many more weeks?
So I believe there's 40 more days in the session. So it could go for another 40 days in theory, right? So, and yeah, I mean, to your point, Marsha, Michaela was very clear. She said there was an off-ramp last week, right? If that bill didn't get cloture, it's done. We move on, and it's sort of, but it did get to closure. So the next day, Senator Kavanaugh basically had filibusters back on. So we, and then in a real kind of turn of events, Friday, right before we adjourned, one of my colleagues, Senator Steve Erdman, had actually submitted a motion to amend/suspend the rules in the legislature. So when we go back tomorrow morning, that's what we are starting with. That debate is so he's looking to
How many votes will it take to get that?
so this is actually something that we are all trying to figure out right now. So we have the ability as a legislative body to temporarily suspend the rules for a specific action. So what we don't have the ability to do, or what I should say is it's not clear if we have the ability to amend the rules permanently in this way. Because if we are going to make a rules amendment, so at the beginning of every biennium, we adopt our new rules, which typically are fairly similar to the rules that we've always had in the legislature, but sometimes there's little tweaks here or there. So we adopted the rules for this year and next year earlier this year when the session first began. So if there's going to be an amendment to that, or if rules are going to be permanently changed, those require a public hearing. They require input from the public, the ability for the second house, which is the citizenry of Nebraska, to have input on that, and then full and fair debate on the floor. The maneuver that is currently in place is a motion which would it would bypass like the hearing process for that. So that's going to be the debate that we have beginning tomorrow morning, is sort of on this motion, and whether or not this could even technically be done based on the rules of the legislature. So it's very eventful. It's been very eventful the last week.
I look and I go, when you talk, I'm amazed. I'm dismayed that that you're right. I mean, this is not a bill I would think that people would die on their sword for, and I'm dumbfounded with some of the bigger things that are coming up, like voter ID.
Yeah.
And the budget. I mean, I just think what do you think they're going to do on voter ID?
I have a question on that, if I may, but I want to see if Tom Everson, or I think it's a woman, Renita Lillyhorn, have a question. They're also in the group here. I can ask them to unmute if they'd like to ask a question. Tom?
I don't have a question. I really am interested in just listening.
Sure, of course.
And I'll own since we're being recorded and it's going to be out there in the public, because John, I empathized with the position that you're in trying to, move anything forward, but I'm not upset at Michaela at all, because it's like, this is ridiculous. And I mean, that's maybe the only word I have to describe that, and it's just sad, because I say to people all the time, I said, I don't know how we're supposed to solve any problems, whether it's in this state, this country, or the world, if our focus is on transgender people and drag queens. I mean, honestly, I mean, really, I mean, those are the things
Those are our problems,
causing all the problems in the world. So anyway, I'm gonna be quiet.
Renita, you're there. Would you like to say it? Would you like to ask a question or make a point?
I don't have a real question at this point. Just being from originally being from Phelps County, there are a lot of issues that I've seen that are before the legislature this year with the bills. One of the ones that I hope gets heard is the broadband issue, and that gets expanded to meet all the needs of Nebraskans this year. And that's just where I'm at with that. So thank you.
That sounds like something that's important for people in the state, doesn't it, Renita?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a really great point, Rita, and I'm happy to speak a little bit on that. So I actually sit on the Transportation and Telecommunications Committee, and so that's where broadband related legislation goes through. So the Governor Pillen, has actually proposed for the establishment of a broadband office in our state, which would be nested under the Department of Transportation. And this is something that we are working on, currently developing through the Transportation and Telecommunications Committee. And I'm actually really excited about that. I never thought I would nerd out on broadband, but it's become one of my favorite topics. And I say that because, we have broadband issues throughout the state, certainly rural parts of the state, we have areas where there are just broadband deserts, for example. And there are a number of reasons why we have that, including but not limited to just the geography of our state and sort of the infrastructure needed to ensure that there's broadband everywhere. But that's just because it's challenging doesn't mean it's not important. And I actually think it's crucial. I think the last few years have taught us anything. It shows that the world we're living in is going to continuing more and more to see remote work opportunities, remote education opportunities, remote healthcare opportunities through telehealth, for example. And so I think if we have inequitable broadband throughout our state, that actually is going to, I think it's an issue we need to seriously tackle, because, what that could lead to is, depending on what your zip code is in Nebraska, you might not have equal opportunity for access to resources if you don't have the access to the broadband. So that's an issue that I think should be the legislature's priority. That's something that I think we should be spending a lot of our brain power on. And Tom, to your point earlier, it has been very frustrating and difficult to think that we are so dug in on issues related to the trans community or a drag ban, for example, when things like broadband deployment these are the things that are really truly impacting Nebraskans' lives, and also have the ability to ensure that we as a state can be competitive moving forward. I think when I was out knocking doors campaigning, I spoke with a few folks whose adult children had moved back to Nebraska from either California or wherever they were living, and they were still working for like a California-based company, but were able to do remote work from Nebraska, so they moved to be closer to family. And so, if we continue to see things like this happening, people are going to continue to be able to choose where they live, which is new. Historically, you had to be physically close to where your employer was, and that's not always going to be the case moving forward. And so things like ensuring that we have reliable, high quality broadband infrastructure in our state is going to help set us apart from maybe some of our Midwest neighbors when folks are kind of considering whether Nebraska is a place that they want to settle and live for the future.
And subsidized childcare too.
Of course, yes, that too. Well, yeah, and that's really, when you think about sort of like prime workforce age, right? These are folks that do have childcare needs as well. So.
Can I pick up on something that Marcia said earlier about voter ID? I've worked the polls as a volunteer, and I've done some research about voting in Nebraska. We do not have a fraud program here, a fraud problem. I'm sorry. To my mind, the elections are conducted fairly, honestly, accurately, and so personally, I found the voter ID vote to be incomprehensible. But my worry now, because I assume this is something you're going to have to get around to after all the other culture war issues are sorted out, my worry is that the voter ID is going to be used as a voter suppression device in this state, disadvantaging people who can't get or can't afford or don't have whatever ID you come up with, the UNICAM come up with. So what are your thoughts about how this is going to be handled equitably so that people are not denied their vote here in Nebraska?
So this is a major concern of mine as well, is how do we ensure that the way we implement this is a way that's first and foremost constitutional, right? As a citizen, you have the right to vote in our country.
Yeah.
And so, history will tell us that, it is illegal to have a poll tax, for example. Voter IDs can be if it is something that has to be paid for, that could be considered a poll tax, right? If someone's unable to afford a driver's license or a photo ID say, for example, the legislature decides that you have to have a state issued ID. So whether it's a driver's license or a personal ID card, if a person is unable to afford that, does that mean that they've lost their right to vote as an American? Common sense would say absolutely not. That's ridiculous. Right. Everyone should have the right to vote. So, these are the things that we need to really think about is when, what are the IDs that are going to be accepted? And is the state going to be providing those IDs to every single eligible voter in the state of Nebraska? Other questions that come up are, what happens if someone loses their ID, right? What happens if, I don't know, like a week before the election, someone was robbed, right? And their wallet was taken, or, do they lose their right to vote then? And so, we're going to have infrastructure in place for someone who shows up to the polls and might not physically have their ID on them. I don't think it would be constitutional.
Too, John, which is very popular and importantly, much more practical in rural Nebraska than here in Omaha or in Lincoln.
So one thing that really fascinated me is a colleague of mine who was from a more rural part of the state actually sort of proposed to have for mail-in voting a notarization required. And I thought to myself, like, how many notaries are in the Panhandle, for example? I mean, like, when you really think about this, and I think that, mail-in voting is something that is very commonly exercised, not just in Omaha and Lincoln, but throughout the state. And maybe even, I haven't looked at the numbers, so I don't want to misspeak, but, certainly in rural parts of the state, this is not something that's non-existent. And so, we need to be making voting easier for Nebraskans, not more challenging and difficult. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of having this mandate from the voters through the ballot initiatives, that we are now required to implement this. The question becomes, how do we do it in a way that's not going to, how do we do it in a way that's as least cumbersome as possible?
Yeah.
Are folks coalescing around one of the bills that have been proposed? I mean, is there kind of a momentum? I mean,
so it's interesting. So those bills were all heard by the government committee. I don't personally sit on that committee. I have heard that the government committee is sort of looking at the smorgasbord of those bills, and they have not yet kicked anything out of that committee. But what you can do as a committee is, once you hear bills, you can do what's called committee amendments. And so sometimes what you see is like a little column A, column B, column C kind of get sort of morphed into a new, like, the committee kind of package of sorts. And bills can sort of be amended by a committee to sort of reflect that. So I have not been privy to those conversations as someone who's not on that committee, but I would imagine that not any one of those single bills. I think what we see kicked out of the committee is going to be somewhat of a, if I had to guess, I would say it'd be somewhat of a combination of the different proposals out there.
Does John Arch say anything like, come on, guys, we got to get going here? I mean, is he worried? I'm worried that you're not going to get through some of this stuff. And I support Michaela. Don't get me wrong. I want you to know I'm hands down with her in spirit every day.
Yeah, I mean, I share your concern. I think that I can't speak for the speaker. What I will say is that, we're a new legislative body this year. So we have 14 new senators this year. And that's something that I think, especially these first few months, like even the old timers, so to speak, right? The more senior members of the body weren't quite sure like what the dynamic was gonna look like in the floor, right? So we all kind of knew what people campaigned on. We kind of knew like a general sense of how people, what their legislative priorities might be or what they look like. But that doesn't always translate to the green or the red button, right? So much of what we have been sort of, I think, experiencing as a legislative body these first few months is, it's kind of like going to college and you're sort of like meeting everyone on your new floor. Like, are they going to get along? Are there going to be sort of like unexpected allies? Is it going to sort of be just all out war, Lord of the Flies style? And so I think that, again, I don't want to speak for the speaker, but I imagine part of it has sort of been kind of observing like what the dynamic is going to actually look like. The way I personally am kind of observing things is that it's sort of like, whoa, okay, this is kind of spun a little bit out of control. And so And
That's
I
what it
think that
looks like from the peanut gallery out here too.
and I think what it and like I said earlier, I think that one of the thing about this past week when 574 had its first round of debate and its first vote, the thing that I can't wrap my mind around is why that advanced. Like I mean, just given again, voter ID, budget, housing, like all these things, property taxes that we talked about as priorities,
Yeah.
all the ARPA funds, the federal funds we have as a state, mental health related. I mean, there's just
Sure.
so much that we need to be doing as a state. And um, I found it shocking that that the legislature has decided that this is, like I said earlier, the hill we want to die on. I mean, I just think it's ridiculous. And I mean, if anything, even if that's your priority or your passion, like, okay, like the first year it was brought, takes years sometimes to get like ideal legislation over the finish line. Like, let's do an interim study, let's explore this further, like let's drop it and move on and like to the things that we actually need to get done and that we actually need to do. It's a bit of a surprise to me that that's not the decision that's been made.
Why do you think those two senators voted for cloture but voted against the bill?
So I can't speak for my colleagues, and nor will I speculate for them. But I think there are a number of people in the body who don't like the bill, like I said earlier, and I think that there has been talk of an amendment to sort of change the bill. And this is a whole nother line of conversation, but I think one of the issues with even an amendment on a bill like that is that what we're doing, and take the topic out of it, what we're doing is with bills like this and also with like bills like 626 is that we're saying that the government and policymakers should be getting between a physician and a patient. And that's just not how medicine works, nor is it how medicine should work. In 574 in particular, we're not only saying the government should be involved with a physician and a patient, we're saying the government should also be involved in parenting and parental choice, which is I think also problematic. And so I think that I think that some of our colleagues are, I think they think the bill is a tough pill to swallow as it is, but they're trying to maybe find an amendment that can make it less tough to swallow. But time there's a bill that legislates the physician-patient relationship, I think it's a very dangerous and slippery slope to do.
Yeah, speaking of dying on hills, John, of course, yet another mass shooting at a school in this country in Nashville. 3 children aged 9, my God, and 3 adults killed with, I think it was an AR-15 again. But yet we have LB 77 in the legislature, concealed carry without a permit. It just seems to me to be so dangerous. We're talking about gun safety in any sense. That seems to be a completely wrong-headed approach, especially without training of any sort. What are the prospects for this thing? Is it just going to be discarded, or does it have some support? LB 77 concealed carry.
So LB 77 had its first round of debate a few weeks back, and it actually had passed its first round of debate. So it's now on select file, which is the second round of debate, and that's actually scheduled for tomorrow for its second round of debate. I don't know if we'll get to it tomorrow, but it is on the agenda for tomorrow. So yeah, it's so to exactly like you said, Peter, this is a bill that would allow for a concealed carry throughout the state without a permit.
Yeah.
I'm opposed to that legislation. I think that there's and I genuinely mean it's like I can appreciate the challenge and the nuance in this, in the sense that we do live in a state that is quite diverse. In other words, like, the needs of the rural parts of the state are very, very different than the needs of, the urban areas. And some of my colleagues will say things like, well, if you don't have a concealed carry permit and you're a farmer and you've got your gun with you out in the field because you need it for whatever reason, right? And it gets chilly, so you put your jacket on, right? Well, then you're technically breaking the law, right? Because you have your concealed carry without your permit. But I mean, sure, right? But I think that the city of Omaha is opposed to this bill. The mayor, Mayor Gene Stothard, is opposed to the bill. The police chief is opposed to the bill, and so and have gone on the record saying this will make the city more dangerous. And so the other thing that we haven't spoken a lot about is that sometimes the city has partial ownership in some of the entertainment venues here, right? So I know it's true. I believe like Pinnacle Bank Arena in Lincoln, I think the CHI Center in Omaha. And so currently these are places that can prohibit firearms, right? But if it's the state law, can they still prohibit? Can people be allowed to concealed carry at a Creighton game or at a concert, and what does that mean? And how do and so there are a lot of, I think, there are a lot of things to consider. I think that what happens with bills like this is that people really get sort of dug into this idea of like this constitutional right. And I think there's obviously merit in that. I mean, I'm not opposed to gun ownership by any means, but I think that with anything, like there are responsibilities that come with that. And I think that it is important that if you are going to own a firearm, there needs to be some checks and balances in place, right? Whether that's a background check, whether that's, if you're gonna have concealed carry, safety training related to that. These are things that are fairly common sense, and these are things that actually have universal, well, not they have overwhelming support through polling throughout our state, throughout the country, but even throughout our state, and this includes rural parts of the state. And so when things are kind of framed in these ways of Senator John Fredrickson wants to take away your constitutional rights because he opposes concealed carry. Well, no, I don't want to take away anyone's constitutional rights to own a firearm, but I want to ensure folks are able to, that are owning firearms are doing so in a way that's safe. And so, we need to ensure public safety throughout all of this. And so,
John, we have a question from Renita. Renita, would you like to pose it verbally? Or do you want me to just read it? Okay. Let's see. Well, okay, your thoughts on LB 794, the Nurse Incentive Scholarship Act. Is that something that you have?
So that is a bill that if I'm thinking of the same one, that might be the Hughes bill that Reapy prioritized. I could be getting that wrong. We have a few bills currently that are looking to incentivize the nursing profession. So we were talking a little bit earlier about workforce throughout the state and issues with that. I mean, healthcare is not exempt to these issues as well. We're seeing shortages in the nursing profession. We're seeing shortages with behavioral health providers throughout the state. I'm a huge proponent of doing whatever we can to incentivize the helping professions, in particular professions that are essential services. Nursing is such an essential service, especially again in rural parts of the state where we are seeing shortages of nursing providers. That's that is key. And so I am a proponent of anything that we can do to incentivize the profession, and also to ensure that we're able to have to attract talent to areas where there are shortages in our state.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Anyone else have a question at this point? Well, John, thank you. Senator Fredrickson, thank you very much for being with us tonight and giving us the benefit of your very interesting baptism in the unicameral. And I just want to say to everyone, thank you for participating, and we are recording, and we'll upload this recording to YouTube, and I'll send out the link via Nextdoor. Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for taking
and
the time.
keep your chin up.
Always,
Get it.
always.
Thank you,
Thank
Senator.
you for serving.
Absolutely. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And yeah, something that we have interest in doing in the future, I'd be happy to. But yeah, thank you for having me, and enjoy the rest of the night.
All right. Good night to all of you.